John and I must confess that we spent a lot of time yesterday when you delivered this box of transcripts because we wanted to see what nuggets there might be in there for an opportunity to excite your memory. But what jumped out more than anything else, and it's out of chronological sequence, but one which certainly intrigued us the most because I think it brings in a little bit about how you got to Nuremberg, but also kind of an intriguing part of your role at Nuremberg, and it's really through a specific instance. So I'm going to give it to you, and maybe first, this is the memo of Harry Truman's to Secretary of State, and you got that. Well, explain how you got that. How you not getting it?
Well, let me say first how very happy I am to be here. And I tell you, I'm amazed at the Jackson Center, about which I knew so little. It is magnificent. And I'd like to congratulate you, Greg, and everyone else really on what I think is a magnificent memorial or commemoration to a great American. And I see that John Barrett is sitting on your right, and I'd have to say if his wife didn't read the local newspaper in Port Washington, I would not be sitting here, because John called me one day and we made a date. I don't know whether he ever told you, I defaulted on the date, and he was very gracious and called me from the restaurant and said, "Did you remember?" And I was sort of in my pajamas and got dressed and rushed over there. Anyway, I'm just delighted to be here. The memo that I hold here has a cover page, which is from Harry Truman, dated December the 10th, 1945, to, I believe, John Barnes, who was then Secretary of State. And it's a cover letter, really, of a letter to President Truman from Justice Jackson. And let me say, it is a whole long story of really the clash between Justice Jackson and Wild Bill Donovan at Nuremberg, and I'll comment on that in a second, which had to do with their theories of how best, I wouldn't say prosecute the Germans, Nazi war criminals, but how best to involve the German people in recognizing their criminality. And this particular letter, I really played an inadvertent and a trivial role, but it precipitated, I think, the end of the controversy between Jackson and Donovan, and it was about the following. There was a German general by the name of Lahusen, who was the second man in what was called the Abwehr. And the Abwehr was the German CIA. And it was possibly the only German organization that even had a handle on the true state of the war, because the Army and the SS and the Gestapo, they were cowed. They were shut off from information and not allowed to talk about it. And the Abwehr kept a diary of day-to-day events, and the Abwehr had the foresight to see each German battle victory as a further step on the road to defeat, because they recognized that each time that the Germans won a battle, the United States would be more likely to come into the war, and the Abwehr, contrary to Hitler, had a very accurate measure of the industrial potential of the United States. And Hitler considered the Americans to be soft and not worthy of fighting, and some Germans had studied the record of the Civil War and the American participation in World War I. So there was this Abwehr. And I found the second in command of the Abwehr, a man by the name, very improbable history, General Erwin Lahusen. He was an Austrian. He came out of the Austrian army, had been a colonel there, and Admiral Canaris, who was the chief of the upway had picked him up, and I was anxious to talk to him soon after we found him, so to speak, to reconnoiter his knowledge so he could be officially deposed. And I made a date with him to see him in the evening, and he didn't show up. And he was not in the jail. He was in what was known as it was a house, a safe house for witnesses that was run by a Hungarian countess who's written about it. And when I sent somebody to find out whether he was at that safe house, I was told that a car, that General Donovan's car had come and fetched him, and that he was at General Donovan's house. So this was about at 8:30 in the evening, and I decided to go to the bar and have a drink and let tomorrow be another day, and I ordered him to be brought up again for interrogation the next morning. And while I was sitting with him in the interrogation room, Colonel Amon bust in and said to Luzin, "What the hell were you doing, sneaking off with my interrogator to see General Donovan?" And Luzin was about to spread his hands and say, "What could I do, a poor prisoner," when the general's car came for me, at which point Jackson appeared and heard this story and took great offense that Donovan had spirited this witness away. It turned out he got to Donovan's house, met Donovan's daughter. They were in the midst of a dinner party, and he never talked to Donovan. But that then precipitated the letter by Jackson, and the burden of it was that Donovan believed very strongly that the most convincing case to the German people could be made by live witnesses. He had originally hoped that Goering would confess and go into a mea culpa act, and Lahusen was his next candidate because he felt that a live confession, regrets, performance in the courtroom would be most convincing, and Justice Jackson did not feel that way. His feeling was that the credibility and the motives of witnesses could always be challenged as being self-seeking or making a grandstand, and he wanted to rely on documents. And in our interrogations, we generally spoke or worked from documents. So there was this division, and it came on top of Donovan's absence from the trial, preparations for the trial itself, for over a month. He went to the Far East in order to wind up the Far Eastern and the Japanese War. And the piece of paper that I hold here is a lengthy report by Jackson to President Truman describing, and I won't even say defending, expounding on his conduct of the trial, and expressing in so many words that there probably had arisen an irrevocable breach between him and Donovan. And Truman, I assume, read it. I'll just read to you what it says on the cover page. It says, "Memorandum for the Secretary of State. I'm sending you herewith a copy of a letter I have received from Justice Jackson, which is self-explanatory, HST. And I have to tell you, even though I play a very, very minor part in it, it is one of my treasured mementos. By the way, which I received from Telford Taylor, whom you all know. He was the head of the subsequent trials, later law professor, and I believe dean at Columbia. And while he was writing his book, he came across this incident and this letter, and he and I were friends, and under the Freedom of Information Act, he got it, and he made this copy of it, and at the bottom, you can see it was officially declassified. Boy, wasn't that a long answer to a short question?
Well, because it brings up other things. Within that package is, in fact, a deposition of Lahusen, of which you're the interpreter, and you are mentioned. Curious, from a personal side, all of a sudden, you're taking questions from the American prosecutor to Lahusen, and Lahusen all of a sudden uses you in the interpretation. How did you feel?
Well, I tell you, let me explain this. I was not a lawyer. I was not a prosecutor. But in the course of interrogations, a very close relationship developed between me and the prosecutors. For instance, Colonel John Holland Amon, who was the chief prosecutor. And by the way, I had grown up in Germany, had a lot of knowledge about the Germans, and most of the prosecutors did not. And after a while, a prosecutor at first would say to me, you know what the questions are, ask him the right questions. And when I asked the right questions and I got answers and we hit pay dirt, I then explained it to the prosecutor, and he would then repeat those questions and get the answers on the record. And with just one or two exceptions, a couple of my affidavits wound up. Justice Jackson used one of them, quite a famous one, but generally, I was sort of reconnoitering. And this man Lahusen was such a find that nobody wanted to go through the elaborate procedure of a translated, interrogation. And Amon said to me, case him for me. Tell me what he knows, find out, and then we'll bring him in and make it official, which was done. And by the way, Lahusen did appear in court, and you've probably found the record of his testimony in court, and he got Goering, so angry that after Lahusen's testimony in court, Goering called him a traitorous swine, couldn't heap enough, contempt on him. But I'm listed as the interrogator because once in a while, due to the pressure of time, there was not enough time for the official prosecutor to repeat the performance. And when I hit something that was hot, sometimes it was used.
So you really had two roles. In one sense interpreter, but in another sense really an interrogator.
Yeah, well, look, my major role was, I was chief interpreter. I had 12 interpreters, 12 stenotypists, and the rest of them were typists that could read the record from stenotype machines, or some of them were so skilled that they could read the official stenographer's shorthand from the notebook. And they produced the rough copies of the interrogation. But because I had such a special relationship with Amon and with Goering, he used me almost exclusively, not exclusively, but almost. And I got to say, to my chagrin, for all of the interrogations of Goering, because I felt that I got to see less of the rest of them. But whenever he or Justice Jackson or Tom Dodd had a really important interrogation like Ribbentrop or Hess or Goering, I was the interpreter. But after they developed trust in me, they let me speak to these, they were then, I guess you'd call them material witnesses, future defendants, in order to case the ground and find out where the pay dirt was. Then after the indictments were served on those that had become defendants, then I became officially an interrogator who found witnesses and interrogated them. And this man Lahusen is an example. Huss is another example. So that I guess I was regarded as an officer of the prosecution, whether I had a law degree or not, because I put these people under oath, and they raised their hand and said, we swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. And I don't remember for a moment the specific interrogation that's included in that package. But I did talk to Lahusen, and he was a cooperative witness.
Set up a normal scene. Your first, for example, let's use Goering. The first time there's a request for you to go and participate in an interrogation of Goering. How did it work mechanically? Did Amon call who? The prison to set up the interview? How would it work?
Well, the function of the prison, the prison commander, was custodial. They were responsible for the safekeeping of these then witnesses, later defendants, in cells, and you've seen the pictures. Their feeding, their medical care, such as it was. They provided religious services for them. They provided psychological support for them. But let's say it was all custodial. Colonel Amon, John Holland Amon, who worked directly for Justice Jackson, was chief of the Interrogation Division, and he controlled access for the purpose of questioning to the prisoners. And nobody was supposed to talk to them or question them, at least on the record, without Colonel Amon's orders. And Colonel Amon and I arrived together from Paris. I was then the only interpreter of what was to become the American prosecution by plane, and I wouldn't know now whether we arrived a day before or a day after Goering. You know, there was a whole bunch of these witnesses, future defendants, transported there from a camp that was called Ashcan, actually a converted hotel in Mondorf. They were flown into Nuremberg and plunked down in the jail. And because Goering was the number 2 man, Amon decided to talk to him first. And that was really my first official interpretation at Nuremberg. And so far as I can remember, it was really my first interpretation where I, as the interpreter, was placed under oath. And I mean, the oath was, do you, Richard Sonnenfeldt, swear that you will translate truthfully, completely, accurately, so help you God? And I'd say yes. And next, the stenographer was sworn in. And Amon always waited until the prisoner was present to do that. So we were sitting in this interrogation room, and let's just say I'm sitting in the chair where the witness, or Goering, later sat. Then right across from me, where the camera is now, would be the interrogator, Amon. To my left over here would be the stenographer, who could use the end of the table, for his notebook or stenotype machine. And over here on the right stood an armed guard. And I think most of the time the prisoners were shackled to the guard until they were brought to the interrogation room, and they were then unshackled, and they were offered a chair, and it was a reasonable, comfortable chair. Now, as to your question, this was not only the first time that I had been placed under oath, but here was Hermann Goering, and he was, so to speak, Hitler's chief operating officer until he fell into disgrace, the, second man in Nazi Germany, an imposing figure, the founder of the Gestapo, somebody before whom had trembled, as a child, who later bombed England when I was there, an imposing figure. I was a 22-year-old PFC, and he came in, and Amon said, state your name. And Goering said, Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering. And Amon said to the stenographer, record that as Hermann Goering. And he said to me in sort of a stage whisper, just don't be too polite to this turkey.
Really?
So Goering, Amon then said to Goering, do you swear that what you're about to testify will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And as I translated it into German, before I got finished, he interrupted me. And he said in German, stehe ich vor einem Richter? I want to know, am I before a judge? Because under German law, it would not be a prosecutor, but a judge most likely, that would have, interrogated him. And I had heard that he was a terror of the interpreter And I knew it was now or never, and I can't take any credit for originality, but suddenly I remembered an old German cartoon which had shown Goering, who was fat, with his white uniform and the diamond-studded marshal's baton and a plumed hat and, a big chest full of medals, and deliberately misspelled his name and called him Gering, Gering, leaving out the O umlaut. And the word Gering in German means a little nothing. It's an untranslatable word. It means paltry, a little nothing. And it suddenly came to me, and I said, Herr Gering, wenn Sie dürfen mich nicht mehr unterbrechen. Sie müssen warten, bis ich fertig bin. So I said, Mr. Gering, you don't interrupt me. You wait until I'm finished. And when I'm finished and you have something to say, then I'll decide whether it's worth pursuing it. So he looked at me and he said in German, Mein Name ist nicht Gering. Mein Name ist Goering. He said, my name is not Gering. It is Goering. And I said to him in German then, okay, I tell you what, if you won't interrupt me, I won't mispronounce your name. And now I have to tell you something. I could read that man's mind because he was the highest ranking surviving German officer. He had already figured out that Eamon was the chief interrogator and I was the chief interpreter. So he now had status. Yeah. It was, I said, all in German apple pie order. And I couldn't do any wrong after that. And I got picked to be the interpreter only because when I interpreted for Goering, there were not a lot of interruptions and there wasn't any debate, about language. The interrogations were efficient, but, I was sort of a robot. And Eamon had explained this to me. He said, when you ask him a question, you've got to try and adopt my tone of voice. And you've got to adopt the expression in my face. So he gets a feeling, what I think of him. And he says, when you answer, to the best of your ability, you've got to transmit his expression, and his feeling and his deportment. And believe me, I was no actor and I am no actor, but I was busy full-time playing roles. I was Eamon when I spoke German, and I was Goering when I spoke English.
Just describe him. He walks into the room, and is this the first time you've seen him?
Yes. Well, he had been captured, let's say, 4 or 6 weeks previously. In fact, he surrendered, and he expected to be treated, as a celebrity in the old knightly, chivalrously way of war. And, the Geneva Convention had something to say about the treatment of officer prisoners. They were to have a Batman and, all the privileges. And so when he was first captured, he expected that. And he was a drug addict because he had intractable pain from a war wound. And he took a narcotic that was known as paracodeine, which is not as bad as morphine, but very addictive. And he took as many as 150 pills a day. So between the time that he was captured and the time I saw him the first time, they had already started weaning him from these drugs. And, it has to be done gradually. He was not down to a 0 dose, but to a low dose. And I think he'd lost many, many pounds, let's say 60 or 70 pounds. And his uniform had been stripped of all the insignia. I mean, I could see where his general's insignia had been on his collar and on his lapel and around his collar, and where all his, medals had been. And the uniform, I mean, it was a fine material, but it was a gray uniform that sort of hung on him. I mean, just imagine a uniform that had been tailored for a man who weighed 260 pounds, who now weighed 200 pounds. And he was sort of dragging himself. He had difficulty walking. And he had, at that time, a mild heart condition. I don't know whether it was arrhythmia, something that was being watched and was a result of his, weight and drug addiction. So he was, per se, not an imposing figure. But the man was only 5'6", and he made an impression larger than life. He was broad-shouldered. He carried himself like an actor, and he sort of dragged himself in the chair. But boy, the minute he sat down in the chair, you could tell he was alert. And, somebody has described him. This is not me. I have my own description of him, but somebody described him as a fantastic brain without a conscience. And, this man, he was out to defend himself in his own way. And what was on his mind was the exact opposite of what Robert Jackson was looking for. Robert Jackson was looking for a confession, an apology, an explanation, if you will. And Goering was looking to be regarded as a German patriot and a hero. And he still dreamt of having a marble monuments built for him all over Germany. So Goering did not voluntarily admit the founding of the Gestapo or his responsibility for concentration camps. But he also didn't deny it, and when he finally appeared in court, he described it all, because by that time he had seen the indictment and he realized that neither he or the other defendants were being prosecuted for what they had done inside Germany. They were being prosecuted for war crimes, crimes against the peace, crimes against humanity, which occurred mainly after the war started, and conspiracy. I mean, those were the counts of the indictment. So that he was a man of unquestioned bravado and courage, who would admit things only, when we forced him to. And he was a dangerous opponent. I mean, Eamon met his match in him, and vice versa. And I had only very, very few private sessions with Goering, and they were not for the purpose of matching wits. It was to get him to sign transcripts of interrogations that were generally kept in English. We made, of important ones, we made German transcripts, and I went over those with him. And sometimes we had little arguments, we had little conversations, but I did not interrogate him like I interrogated Lahusen or Hess or others. So by calling him Gorink, which was a moment of inspiration, we got the relationship straightened out.
Did he ever question your interpretation? Because he knew English.
Pardon?
Did he question at any point your translating what he said into English? Because clearly he knew English.
Well, there was a very famous incident when General Donovan interrogated him about, that the Nazi government officially not only condoned, but ordered the lynching of downed or parachuting British and American airmen. And the order really, I don't remember right now whether Goering signed the order, or whether he knew about it, but it came out of his office. And Donovan was questioning him about that order, and also still in an attempt to convince him that all was lost and maybe he should confess. And Goering answered one of his questions as, "I don't admit that." And I rendered it in English as, "I don't admit that." And I was a PFC, and General Donovan was a major general, and he said, "Dick, That's not what he said. He said, I don't agree to that. And here said Goering with his English and big grin on his face, I said I do not admit to that. So he was exerting his authority over the general to protect his little private.
You described somebody else's description of Goering, and yet you said you also had your own. Did you just give that to us, or do you have a separate description of Goering?
He was a robber baron. He was a man without conscience. Even though it was not my own, I accept the description of him as a man with a brain, courageous, bold, no conscience. And people, would say to me, what, didn't you hate him? How did you react to him? And I give you my answer. You don't hate and despise every criminal from the beginning. I mean, criminals can be very charming people, and Goering also, had a kind of charm. In his distress, knowing he was headed for the rope, he could still laugh. He could laugh at himself. He had very interesting incidents of things that he had done that showed a totally perverted conscience or sense of humor, and he would slap his knees and with great glee and almost bellow out with laughter. So he was not a sniveling coward like Ribbentrop. He didn't look like an arch criminal, as I have to say some of them did. He, his manner still demanded respect. So I never knew whether to be pleased by the fact that he insisted whenever he could that I be his interpreter, because it certainly was a two-edged honor, right, to be chosen by this arch criminal. But it was generally known, and people would tease me in Nuremberg and call me Goering's favorite.
Did you feel like did you at any time, what you just said there, feel like he was sort of reining you in? Maybe he was being you would like you to be a little deferential to him, or did you get a sense he was playing you a little bit?
Well, I tell you what, after the first two interrogations, let me say, when we came to Nuremberg at first, it was not at all clear what total role Goering had played in Nazi Germany. Everyone knew that he was the builder of the Luftwaffe, that he was the commander-in-chief of the Air Force. We knew, of course, he lost the Battle of Britain, and I don't know whether you know, the Air Force had a sorry record in Russia. He was the czar of the 4-year economic plan. We knew very little about the fact, we should have known, because it was there, that he converted the Gestapo, which existed, into an instrument of terror, and it was Goering who deputized 50,000 SA men as auxiliary police, and it is they who arrested and incarcerated Hitler's opponents virtually the night after the fire of the Reichstag, the German Parliament building. And because they did it so quickly, you could have reconstructed, they had the lists made out long ago. So we did not know the full extent of Goering's guilt, of the fact that it was he, in his capacity, the second man in the Reich, who ordered the extermination of the Jews. He signed and sent that order to Heydrich, who was nominally a subordinate of Himmler, and it led to that famous Wannsee conference in January of 1942, after the Germans were in Russia, that then resulted in the creation of the extermination camps. So as to your question, it took a long, long time for me and everybody else to understand not only the total extent of Goering's participation and criminality and guilt. It took literally until March or April for us to understand the total extent of the Holocaust. If you told me that the Germans had killed 40 or 80,000 Jews or Gypsies or whatever, Gypsies, in camps like Dachau or Buchenwald, I would have believed it. But we had no idea that millions, were exterminated in places like Auschwitz and Birkenau. And, one of the great things that the Nuremberg trial accomplished, it wrote the history and the record of what it really, happened in Nazi Germany. Because without getting it from the originators and getting the statements under oath and finding the documents, the historians would still be arguing about whether it ever happened. And despite the evidence, some of them do. But that record, the whole record of killing millions of Russian prisoners deliberately by starvation and sickness and whatnot, that was all discovered, made public, let's say, at the Nuremberg trial through documents that the documentation division under Robert Jackson found. There were barnfuls of documents, and I'm not here to say that it would not have been discovered and documented anyway, but it was all brought together. That was the first comprehensive history, of Nazi Germany that was written. And what people forget, I think, the relatively narrow argument whether it would be better to have prominent Germans confess or to convict them by documents pales beyond the enormous accomplishment, right, to document the history of Nazi Germany, a whole country, a whole government, going back to 1923. Something that has never been accomplished before in any historical inquest, that no single government, no historian, could have done. And so this unfolded, I would say, between, to us a little earlier, some of it, but really between the start of the trials in November of 1945 and the end of the trials, in the early summer of 1946. So our relationship, to these people grew, if that's the word, in a negative way, as we recognized the true extent of their criminality. In the beginning, we were investigators.
At the beginning, when you first arrived, you were an interpreter, but you were not the chief interpreter.
Well, I was the interpreter.
Oh, you were the, okay.
Well, look, the OSS. OSS was given the task to prepare for war crimes trials before the charter was written, that is before the London Conference, before Nuremberg was selected, before the law under which they were going to be tried was established. So we were in a preparatory phase, and we worked out of Paris. And we were a unit of OSS called the OUSCC, became the OUSCC, the Office of the U.S. Chief of Counsel. And Eamon was there, and Brookhart was there, and a small staff. And I think that the documentation division was also in Paris, notably Sturry and Baldwin, but it was all preparatory. Then, after the charter, which was on August the 5th, I believe, 1945 was issued, At a further conference, I mean, then the prosecutions were organized, and by default, I was the only permanent interpreter. I mean, they would make trips and, find somebody who could speak German or whatnot. So when I arrived in Nuremberg, I was the only one. And because I was Eamon's interpreter, and all of a sudden they needed more, I was called the chief of the interpretation section. Another colonel by the name of Williams was the operations officer really for Eamon. And he organized, and suddenly, I was the chief interpreter. And, nobody ever checked my German. My English was pretty good, and they'd bring these people in, and I'd try them out. And I kept some of them, didn't keep others, but that's how it happened. I mean, it was not exactly according to a carefully thought out plan.
You came in really through General Donovan.
General Donovan had been in Austria, and he was interviewing some people in Austria that had cooperated with OSS during the war, and I was then sworn to secrecy, and there's no need to discuss their names. I mean, they played no part in anything else, and Donovan arrived at the airport in Salzburg from Paris without an interpreter. And there was a Colonel Tom Hinkle with him. And Hinkle said, we're going to need an interpreter. And they were met at the airport, by somebody from the motor pool. Thank you. And I think that guy said, there's a guy at the motor pool who can speak German pretty well. So I was lying under an armored car, greasing it, when somebody said, pardon the crudity, Sonnenfeldt, get your ass out of here. I said, out of where? Well, the general needs an interpreter. And I said, what general? You asshole, don't ask any questions, just get out here. And I had, grease on my nose, my fingers were dirty. And here stood this Colonel Tom Hinkle, who later, by the way, also went to Nuremberg. And he was in a resplendent garrison uniform, which I hadn't seen for years, right? And this pudgy, fat man sat in, for a moment, I can't think of the name of a vehicle, command car, not a Jeep, command car, it's like a Jeep little bit. He was sitting there, he had a chest full of ribbons and 2 sewn-on stars, and he said, let's get going, soldier. And he spoke some German. And he said a couple of sentences in German, and I translated them, and he said either then or there or later, he says, this guy's English is better than any interpreter we've had. And so then Hinkle said to me, how would you like to come with us? And I said, where to? Where are you headquartered? He said, Paris. I said, I'm what? So it literally happened like that. He said, pack your bags and come. And, my sergeant or lieutenant yelled at me, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to Paris with the general. You son of a gun, you're going to be AWOL. And Hinkle said, don't worry, I'll take care of it. He was OSS. But, I didn't apply for the job. That's how it happened. What can I tell you?
When it was, the whole Jackson-Donovan was playing out, did you have a sense as to what the scuttlebutt was among the staff, one way or the other? Would they like some guys flipping for Donovan?
Well, you've got to remember, Donovan was involved in the early discovery proceedings, in the sense that OSS was responsible for finding evidence. And naturally, they worked to an extent with military intelligence. But military intelligence talks to soldiers on the battlefield that you captured. They don't know anything about government or policy, care less. And OSS did the original investigation. Now remember, the London Conference, which determined the trials occurred on August the 5th, I believe. And VJ Day was August 8th? Don- Yeah, so see, but VJ Day, occurred within a week, let's say, of August the 5th. And Donovan took off immediately for Japan. Because while the preparations in Europe, for a trial had already progressed to the point that documents had been found and this and that and the other, there was immediate talk of trying the Japanese leaders. And Donovan then took off, and he stayed in the Far East for at least a month. So he had almost no participation in the stage of the Nuremberg trials that, on balance, was the most interesting, which was the interrogation phase, of the future defendants, and the interrogations and the documentation that was found, contributed greatly to the indictment, which was handed out on October the 20th. So Donovan was absent during most of that time, and the people that had worked for him, normally, people like Amon and Story and Brookhart and Curly Williams, were transferred, so to speak, out of OSS, and then this OUSCC, the Office of the U.S. Chief of Counsel, reported directly to the commanding general of American forces in Europe, which was Eisenhower for a few weeks and then General McNamara. So Donovan was removed from the direct chain of command of all the people who then worked for Jackson. And he was listed, I believe, as associate counsel or an executive counsel, but clearly, as far as the trial is concerned, subordinate to Robert Jackson, who was chief of counsel. And Donovan then reappeared, I would say, for a week or two in Germany. When he reappeared in Nuremberg, he immediately grabbed me because he wanted to talk to Goering. And he had that interrogation which I mentioned, I think only one. And he was convinced that, Goering would not be the one to confess. And he was still looking for somebody who would confess. And the interesting thing is, he invited Lahusen and spirited him away to his house, but never talked to him. And by that time, I'm not privy to it other than what you can read in the letter. I think he and Jackson had at least cooled off to each other, and I think it had one or two polite arguments. And Amon was a bitter foe of Donovan, which I think went back to New York politics. And Story, I think, was jealous because he was sort of considered the senior deputy by Jackson, because Story headed the documentation division, on which Jackson put, great value. So, Donovan just packed up and went away. And there were not, there were not many rumors, and not many rumors that I know of.
Was Amon getting boxed out as the trial got closer by Story and others?
I don't believe that Amon got boxed out by Story. I think Amon was never really in the sense that Story was in, because Jackson from the beginning put great value on the collection and screening of documents. And the documentation division was much bigger than the interrogation division, and it had its own translators. I and the people who worked for me had nothing to do with translating the German documents on which our interrogations were based. So while Story and Amon, had apparently equal rank, I think that story was sort of the favorite, if I can use that word. And Story conducted interrogations. I interpreted for him. I mean, it was a badge of honor for people like Story or Baldwin. They would ask Eamon's permission, and he always granted it. But Brundage, I don't know whether you know that name. You know, they all came around at one time or another. It was a badge of honor, you know, to question those Germans, or they had specialized knowledge from the documentations that they had used. And slowly and slowly and slowly it sank in on Jackson that a trial based entirely on documentation wouldn't capture the imagination of the Germans. And then slowly and too late there was more emphasis on getting journalists involved who were bored to death. But I forget whether it was Sprecher or Baldwin. I think it was Sprecher maybe convinced Jackson to show this horrible film of concentration camps in court as really the first live demonstration of how evil that regime had been and the effect of it. You know, to see murders and criminals killing people and shoving them into graves, you know, with bulldozers. You know, you've read the description of the effect, you know, of that film, and that convinced Jackson to get more of the human element into the trial, and he, I think there was more than one film shown. I think there were 3 films shown altogether, and then when we did, pardon?
Did you see the film?
Yes. Well, the film is horrible. I mean, these 2 gentlemen have seen excerpts in it, in the official Nuremberg film. I mean, look, it shows not people being killed, but it shows stacks of dead bodies, emaciated bodies, bulldozers shoving dozens, hundreds of bodies, you know, into mass graves. Some of the other films, I mean, you know, included similar scenes, but then we discovered witnesses. You know, the names may not mean much to you. Schellenberg, Ohlendorf were commanders of what I called the retail killers. Ohlendorf was attached to the army in Russia. He headed what was known as an Einsatzgruppe, a task force of the SS, and the poor guy could brag only about killing 90,000. He had antiquated methods. They shot him in the neck, or they put him into gas vans, and he became a live witness. So that instead of, and then Lahusen, whom I discovered. So what happened is that we never found a member of Hitler's inner circle who came up with a full-blown confession. I'll talk about Speer in a minute, you know, as an exception, but what we did find was the killers, like Schellenberg and Ohlendorf and Huss, and the effect of having them sit there live and describe, you know, how they killed tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions. I mean, Huss admitted that 3.5 million had died in Auschwitz. He got very perturbed when I accused him of that, because he said only 2.5 were incinerated. The rest of them died of other causes. Like what? Well, illness and starvation. So that Jackson, I think, became more appreciative of the, if not the legal value, the historical value, and if I may use the word, the political value of having human testimony. And you know, in those days there was no television, so you could only have movie cameras. And I don't know that there was a movie house standing in Germany to show the march of time. So, you know, to transmit what these people saying in court presented, you know, substantial obstacles, and our friend Ernie Michel, you know, is one of those who reported to it. And then, finally, we discovered Lahusen. And Lahusen, of course, was not a killer, but he knew what what had gone on at Hitler's headquarters where the orders had been issued. So, I mean, he became a very, very effective prosecution witness. And the only exception to what I'm telling you was Speer. And the interesting thing about Speer is he didn't look like a criminal. He didn't act like a criminal. He couldn't be accused of a conspiracy because he didn't become Hitler's minister of munition until 1943 when the war was already underway. He'd been an architect until then. And what Speer did, he stood up and he indicted the regime. He indicted Hitler as an evil man. He indicted dictatorship as the most stupid of all forms of government, saying that terrible mistakes were made and will be made again when you believe that one man is all-powerful, and all-knowing. And Speer managed to do all of that and really deliver a tirade to the great chagrin of Goering without ever admitting that he himself had employed 5 million slave laborers. Now, they weren't rounded up by him. They were rounded up by a man by the name of Sauckel. They were, collected in France and Russia, Jews, non-Jews, Dutch, Belgians, women, and whatnot. And I think that the judges, I hate to use that word, the judges were so delighted to have one of the defendants get up and characterize the entire regime and Hitler and all of his associates as evil and brutal and stupid. And I have to say that for a reason that I know nothing about and that I don't quite understand, Jackson never pressed Speer for the details of his own doings. I mean, he let Speer off in cross-examination, in my opinion, very, very lightly. And whether he did that, it could have been to save the credibility of that man in the indictment of the regime. And a cross-examiner might have thought, if I drive this guy into the corner and he starts lying, that will then impair what he said about the regime. So I'm speculating. I know nothing about that. But it is a fact that Jackson did not go hard, at Speer. So I don't know. I think I did more than answer your question.
Were you in the trial portion or primarily in the interrogation?
Pardon?
Were you in the courtroom during the trial?
I had a very minor and relatively infrequent role in the courtroom. After these people were indicted on October the 20th, I could no longer talk to the defendants. I mean, they could only talk to their own defense lawyers. I talked to witnesses. And I was brought into the courtroom, for instance, when Eamon read the record of interrogations of Goering, let's say, or others, into the record in lieu of testimony, and the record was translated in the courtroom from Eamon's English rendition into a German rendition that the defendants could understand. And the defendants then answered in German, and their answers were translated back into English. And I was there, so to speak, as an enforcer to make sure that nothing was said in the courtroom that substantially disagreed with what we had previously found, right, in interrogation. And I'm happy to say nothing did. Then I was brought in the courtroom, for instance, when people like Schellenberg and Ohlendorf and Hus and Lehusen were there as witnesses, for the same reason, because they were taken by other prosecutors, basically through the material that had been discovered, in interrogation. Hess was originally brought in as a defense witness. I mean, it was idiotic. He was to swear that he'd never seen Kaltenbrunner in a concentration camp, and then we found out he was the guy who ran Mauthausen, and while he was a defense witness, we got him to spread the whole record, of what happened in Auschwitz, which he did unflinchingly, and as far as we know, honestly. I mean, he's a whole other thing. So my role in the courtroom, I had no legal rule. I had nothing to say. I was there as a monitor, and I would say, I don't know how many sessions there were, more than 100. I would say I probably would have been present at maybe 20 or so, and I would sit next. Usually I sit next and behind the particular prosecutor who was conducting either the direct or the indirect, examination, ready to pull a little at his coat, if something happened that wasn't right, and I never did.
We're going to stop just to change taker. This has been too.
Tiered, for the ministry in the Eastern Zone, and suffered for it. I mean, they themselves, I won't use the word persecuted, but shunned. Their children weren't allowed to get higher education. So they went, if you will, as missionaries.
Under the communist regime.
If you will, as missionaries, out of conviction, and they were so impressive to me that.
You guys back on?
Ron, go ahead. Yeah.
Let's turn to Jackson. What's your memory of first seeing him?
Well, my office was literally down the hall from this, around the corner. If you can imagine the court building in Nuremberg, the front had a row of offices, and then there are long corridors at the left end and the right end. And if I stood in the rear of the building and looked to the front, the left wing was the interrogation wing, and the right wing was the documentation wing, and Bob Jackson occupied the middle offices in that middle corridor, right? And originally the halls were very dim. You've been in the building. I mean, there was almost no daylight. I mean, they had these old stone steps. And my first memory is that as I was going to my office one morning, a man went in the other direction, and somebody says, "There goes Justice Jackson." And I really wished I'd seen him better, because all I saw was his back as he went down the hall. But then I tell you, I saw him daily, not to talk to. I mean, I met him in the hall. He was a man who very often went out of his office, and I think I understood why. When he visited somebody else, he could choose the time when he left. He didn't have to throw him out of his office, because he was sought after for good reason and not so good reason. I mean, the good reasons were basically to get guidance, in the conduct of his trial. Robert Jackson had done much, I guess, to write the law, which, as you know better than I, was a mixture of common law and European law. Procedures were common law procedures, but, the rules of evidence were somewhat different. There was no jury there. So people, members of the prosecution, had good reason to seek his guidance. And, he had a lot of difficulties to overcome with the British. Among other things, I was also later the liaison officer of the British and the Danes and others. And I mean, it would be unnatural if, in that kind of an international assembly, there weren't different opinions. But I have to tell you, there is no question in my mind that Robert Jackson was the dominant personality in organizing the trial and make it happen. No question in my mind that Jeffrey Hall was the dominant figure in the courtroom. And I'd have to say the British prosecutors, I mean, dear Lord, wonderful performance, but Jackson, you can't think of the Nuremberg trial without Jackson. It just wouldn't have happened.
Now, in addition to seeing him in the hallway, how much exposure did you get to him in the interrogation room? And
Well,
what do you remember about actually getting to work with him or seeing him in action?
Well, I remember at least two scenes very clearly, and I think there were more, but not as significant. One is he interrogated Goering personally, and I believe the record of that interrogation is around, and I was the interpreter, and Eamon was present, and maybe Sturry was present. And I think the purpose of that interrogation was to convince himself or unconvince himself of the validity of the Donovan theory of trying to get a confession out of that man. And I think what Jackson was trying to do was to get a personal measure of Goering more than, I think, boring in on any specific subjects. I mean, I can remember the interrogation itself, but I got to tell you, nothing extraordinary about that interrogation sticks in my mind. Now, another interrogation, of Jackson's was occasioned by a letter that was written by one Ribbentrop, who was the Hitler's ex-foreign minister, and he wrote a letter, quote, which offered to take responsibility for everything. I forget whether it was that it had been done in his name, but by the German government, and it was addressed also to Jackson, I believe. But anyway, Jackson interrogated Ribbentrop, I think also to find out whether or not this guy could become the all-confessing, evil spirit, Nazi Germany. After all, he was number 3 in the dock. So, and you have the copy of that interrogation. I mean, I can hear it like today. Jackson said, you wrote me this letter, you take responsibility for everything. By the way, Ribbentrop spoke English, so I sat in to help out when needed. But I heard the whole thing, and he said, can you tell me anything specific that you'll take responsibility for? And Ribbentrop had a habit of dribbling at the mouth and saying absolutely nothing. The sentences would tumble over each other, and he started one of these, and Jackson would come up with a sharp question. Well, weren't you involved in the persecution of the Jews? And I mean, there would be razzmatazz from Ribbentrop, that went on. Well, I heard about it, and that was all Hitler, on and on and on. And he was a disgusting character. However, in that interrogation, something happened that I tell you without hesitation, because it doesn't diminish Robert Jackson's reputation, but it shows the great difficulty that existed for American prosecutors who didn't know Germany, the German government, or how the Hitler government operated. He said to Ribbentrop, well, didn't you refuse to give passports to the Jews and therefore become responsible for the death of tens of thousands? And Ribbentrop said, oh, it had nothing to do with it. And Jackson said, how can you? You were the foreign minister. And of course, what Jackson was doing was equating the passport function of the Secretary of State in this country with that of the foreign minister, equivalent of Secretary of State. Well, I knew it was not a foreign ministry function because I'd gotten my passport. It was a police function in Germany, and I didn't quite know how to do this. I finally was able to slip a little note to Jackson and said, he was never responsible for that. It was a police function, but he was responsible for that. And Jackson just sort of barely turned around and nodded and changed his, line of questions, and I offer that little glimpse not as criticism, but as an illustration of the difficulty. And I think to diverge for a minute, the famous scene between Jackson and Goering in the courtroom when Jackson accused Goering of having ordered the liberation of the Rhine. And the German word was Freimachung, which meant its freeing of ice. And some little clerk in the documentation division had translated the German document faultily, leading Jackson to believe that Goering in 1934 had ordered the military liberation of the Rhine, when he had merely ordered the clearing of the river of ice. So I mean, there were difficulties when you had different cultures, and so I got caught, several times of those, and I managed to write little slips of paper or thump the table, and with Eamon, it got to be real easy. I mean, when he couldn't help it either, but he realized instantly when something was off base, and he would consult with me. And it had nothing to do with the law. It had to do with knowing, specific German conditions. And the opposite happened too. These guys got accused of things that weren't crimes, and sometimes they weren't accused of things that were crimes.
Were you ever called to Jackson's office or in meetings with him and other staff members?
I think I was in his office once or twice. Once or twice, but I was called in connection always with matters that had to do with an interrogation, that I had translated, or a witness was coming up, or in the case of Lahusen, I had done most of it. I was called to Jackson to his office once because I had interrogated General Franz Halder, who was Chief of Staff of the German Army, who was not accused of anything. He'd been fired by Hitler when he ordered the retreat from Moscow, because Hitler's only strategy was advance, 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 until he killed himself in Stalingrad, right? But Halder was retired against his will and was very bitter. And Halder was still trying to prove that he'd been right and Hitler had been wrong. And I had a close relationship with him. And Goering and he hated each other. And I asked Halder, just out of nothing really, had you ever been at Hitler's headquarters when Goering was there? And he said, oh yeah, I was there for his birthday, July the 20th in 1941. And I said, why do you mention it? He said, well, during the conversation turned to the Reichstag, the German Parliament building. And he said, Goering slapped his knee in glee. And he said, oh, the Reichstag, he says, you all know that I set it on fire. And Halder said, all of a sudden there was icy silence around the table, and Goering blushed because, he had been accused of staging that fire as the excuse for arresting Hitler's opponent. And I said to Halder, are you willing to repeat that statement under oath? And I took a statement under oath. It's an affidavit. And Jackson introduced it in evidence against Goering, right? And before he introduced it, he called me into his office and he said, tell me, how did you get this affidavit? I mean, Jackson wanted to make sure to understand the circumstances, right? And I saw Goering once after that. I don't know what the occasion was. I think it was at that interlude. And I said, how about that affidavit from Halder? And you know what he said? Oh, he said, that was just one of my jokes. And I said to him, can you tell me, can you remember another joke you told Hitler?
That's great. What about Jackson away from the Palace of Justice? Did you ever have any Grand Hotel or Firth or
He,
wherever contractor?
he was not, I don't remember him in the Grand Hotel because he had his own quarters and he had a housekeeper and his son and Elsie Douglas were there, and he had a personal bodyguard that he sort of considered unnecessary, but they forced him to have a personal bodyguard, and they gave him, I don't know, some great big Maybach touring car as his official vehicle, I think, which he rejected. And I was at his house once, for some occasion, and I said, "Hello, Mr. Justice," and he says, "Hello, Dick." And, he was busy with other people, and there were a lot of good-looking secretaries there. It was a party.
Right.
But no.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to remember, I had no legal function. I had no strategy function. I had a 10th grade education. I was bilingual. That was my claim to fame.
Tell us about the opening statement.
Well, there's so many things to say about the opening statement, and look, I'm not sure that I can get the order of things he said right, but I remember things he said, and I remember them to my dying day. I mean, he said, among other things, pleading. I mean, for a fair, respectable trial. I mean, he said, if we pass these defendants a poisoned chalice, then history will force us to drink from that same chalice. He said, I mean, any monkey business, what it meant. Any monkey business will come back to haunt us. He said, it was just in my mind, it'll come back in a second. Oh, he said, if you have a trial like this one, you have to be prepared that some of them will be pronounced innocent. Because if you hold them all guilty from the beginning, you might just as well hang them now. And so I remember statements. I mean, I remember his closing statement, the caricature of the defendants. He made a memorable statement that some people have considered to be very dangerous and resented, but in his closing statement, he described what the defendants had done. And he said, Germany was in the hands of the police, and the police was in the hands of the party, and the party was in the hands of the SS, and the SS was in the hands of these men, all of which was true, and some people have construed that as an exoneration of, the German people at large, because he described them as being, under control and dominated. And he was right, which was absolutely true in the, once Hitler was in power. How he got in power is another question. But look, what I remember, in addition to his words, which you and I can look up in the archives, what's his sense of history? And I remember something else.
And that was palpable in the moment.
Oh, let me tell you, for instance, his opening statement, he took a position on the law, because even before the trial started, there were outcries of ex post facto law, and there was a famous ban on tu coquet, I'm sure I'm not saying it right. How do you say it? Tu coquet, which is Latin for, you're accusing me of something that you yourself did. You're just as guilty as I am. And those things were ruled out by the charter of the tribunal. And I remember Jackson taking a position saying, these defendants are going to be tried under law which has not been practiced, but it really has existed in the treaties and in the morals, of the civilized people. And he said, this is the first time that this law, a moral law which has existed, for decades and hundreds of years, will be applied. And I'm sure I'm not quoting his words exactly, but what he was saying is that we were really doing, what morality and civilization and decency, demanded. And, people have asked me how I felt about it. Well, the procedure was a common law procedure, and U.S. courts, district courts, superior courts, Supreme Courts make new law all the time, trying to be consistent with history and morals and practice, and those new laws stand, until reviewed by a higher court. And John, I'm not enough of a lawyer to know whether that applies only to civil law or to criminal law. However, my own feeling that Robert Jackson was a spokesman for the civilized world, for decency, for application of the law, was confirmed by the United Nations in January of 1946, which many people regard only as a genocide convention, but it confirmed much more. It confirmed much more, of the law that had been practiced. And if you ask yourself what reviewing authority existed or could have ever existed, for the Nuremberg trials, it was the United Nations, and it was the General Assembly of the United Nations with a huge, huge vote. I think in essence endorsed the legitimacy, of the Nuremberg trials, as far as, as that was possible. And, Jackson, impressed me by his demeanor about the absolute need to be fair and decent, but not to shy away from prosecuting criminals. And I have to tell you, it was that attitude, that encouraged me, that little private first class, to write the justice of the Supreme Court a little note, because I knew he cared more about getting it right, than anything else, and he wouldn't worry. He wouldn't worry about whether I was fresh or out of line or whatnot. He wanted to get it right, and that's what impressed me. Now, people, have also accused him of being a little haughty. He was intense. He was a man with a mission, and he did not always kindly tolerate arguments that didn't support that view.
Describe this.
Never saw it before. It's a picture of Justice Jackson decorating me, and I use the word decorating. By the way, I have a copy of the actual citation. I don't really know whether it rated a medal, but it was the equivalent of the Legion of Honor for an enlisted man. There was no such thing. When you look at that picture, another man, who was quite famous and still alive, is standing in the background, smiling benignly, and that is then either Lieutenant or Lieutenant Commander Whitney Harris. And it's Justice Jackson pinning that ribbon on me and reading the citation. And Greg, I don't know whether you have a copy of it.
I do not.
What?
No, I do not, but I have a sense as to what it said here. And if I could interject here, it says, as Chief of the Interpretation Section of the Interrogation Division, Sonnenfeldt took a leading role in the establishment and supervision of an organization of approximately 50 persons which furnished the interpreters for for the interrogation of over 75 different major witnesses, including 21 major Axis leaders. Sonnenfeldt recommended policies and procedures concerning the treatment of prisoners during interrogations, and the procedures were found so sound and practical that they were approved and have been used by the interrogators to date. Among the personnel in Sonnenfeld's section were military personnel of grades and ranks higher than his and civilians of many different nationalities. He handled them with such amazing diplomacy and tact that he managed to enlist their wholehearted cooperation in spite of so many differences. Part of the citation.
Yeah, the rest of it, I mean, is all the usual military formality, but as you can see, Justice Jackson pinned that ribbon on me, you know, personally, and I have to tell you, it was a total surprise to me. I mean, I was told to, I believe, come up to his office, or maybe it was in the courtroom, I don't remember, and so I thought I was coming to something, to witness something or see something, and Robert Jackson said to me, "No, it's you, Sonnenfeldt, you come here."
What an honor.
So anyway, that was one of the, I have to tell you, it was one of the great moments of my life, and I looked like I have my eyes closed, and I'm thanking my good fortune at that moment, you know, of having been able to get out of Germany and surviving and make my little contribution at Nuremberg.
This was as you were preparing to depart?
It was,
Or before that?
no, it was as I was preparing to depart. It was in July, I believe. I mean, it took months and months to wend its way. By the way, I never found out who made the recommendation. I mean, somebody at Nuremberg. It said by order of the commanding general, U.S. forces, and I was at least 17 levels down, so it must have bucked 17 levels up and 17 levels down, and it took, I don't know, 7 or 8 months really to make the round trip. So I think I was very lucky that I was still there and Robert Jackson was still there.
You had some very memorable interrogations, and one of them was Rudolf Hirsch. You talked about him a little bit earlier, but as that unfolded and you heard what you heard, you had to have more than just a professional reaction to what the information that Rudolf Hirsch was presenting.
I will answer that. I will answer your question in a minute. I mean, people have said to me, more simply, didn't you hate the bastard? Didn't you hate him? I tell you, when I felt hate and could have killed somebody without asking questions, and that's when I made a stop at Dachau, the concentration camp, 20 minutes or so after the SS guards had fled. And I saw these, there were stacks of corpses there. They were walking corpses. There were inmates there who physically were so weak, they couldn't tolerate the joy of liberation. I mean, I don't know whether you've ever seen somebody die in front of your eyes. And the guards were gone, and some of the big bloodhounds that they'd used to chase those poor souls were still there, and some of the inmates who had the strength were clubbing those dogs to death. And there was a terrible smell there. The people didn't dare to go outside of the camp through the gate because they didn't know what was on the outside. They weren't completely convinced yet that we were their liberators, and I went there on a silly rumor that some of the SS guards had clothed themselves in the garb of the prisoners. And if I'd had my wits, I would have realized that would have been complete nonsense, because it would have been a pink-cheeked, well-fed, you know, man with close-cropped hair in a prisoner's uniform. But that's why I went there, to help my lieutenant discover whether any of the guards, you know, were hiding among the inmates. And I tell you, at that moment when I saw that, if I'd seen any of the SS guard, I was so angry. I was so I hated at that moment. I would have killed him. Now, Hess, was brought up in March or April of 1946. He had once been discovered, then had been able to hide as an agricultural worker, then had been denounced in the British zone, and he was brought to Nuremberg as a defense witness. And then we found out who he was, and there he was. He was a man in an SS uniform. I mean, they had stripped his insignia of rank and his epaulets, and he was such an insignificant figure when I first saw him that you wondered whether he was really there. And from the first word that I asked him, I realized that for whatever reasons, this man was telling all. You know what I'd expected was another one of those thugs. And I mean, strangely enough, Schellenberg and Ollendorf, who were also executioners, told all. And I think it was because they realized they were going to be hanged. And their story was what they did on orders. It would have never entered their minds to refuse to obey or carry out an order. And here was Hess. And, almost the first question I asked him, is it true, that you exterminated 3.5 million people? And no, he said, that's not true. It was only 2.5 million. And what happened to the others? Well, they died of other causes. That was the official classification. Other causes, like what? Well, they were ill, and no matter how hard I tried, we couldn't get enough food for them. They died of starvation. So what can I tell you? I got so engrossed in having a witness who, for the first time, we had survivors, but we had not had a concentration camp commander. And we'd had some low-level guards who were, basically criminal types. But this guy, had the title of a major general in the SS, and here he was telling all, right? And I got so engrossed in, for the first time, of finding out, what really went on in an extermination camp, and how it was organized, and how he received his orders, and who he received them from. And remember, it was March or April. I'd already seen Dachau itself, and I'd seen those horrible films, in the courtroom. And unless I get my time wrong, I believe I know in interrogation, believe also in the courtroom, had already heard the testimony of Schellenberg and Ollendorf. So, I was hardened. And, you go to a mortuary and you see a dead body the first time, it's a terrible shock. And by the 20th time, it's still horrible, but you don't get that tightening of the stomach, or the feeling of the hate. So when I met Hess, and remember, I'd been a combat soldier, I'd been shot at, I had shot at Germans. Hess was not my first experience. He was really the last, and in many ways the most horrible and the most amazing. He was an absolute robot who had to have somebody give him orders, and he had to have people to give orders to. He was a link in a chain. He did tell me one thing. He said, I asked him, how about Himmler? Himmler was God to the SS and to the Gestapo and the concentration camp commanders. And I said, how about now? He said, it's only in the last few months, when I've been able to read newspapers and see what has been going on at this trial, that I ever had the slightest doubt that he was telling me the truth. He venerated, didn't even talk about Hitler, he venerated Himmler. And, you've probably read some of those things in my book. He told me one once he caught SS man stealing gold that had been, made into ingots that were sent to the Reichsbank in a vault. And he caught one of his SS men taking either a bayonet or a combat knife and hacking off a corner of this ingot, a hunk of gold, quarter of an ounce or half an ounce. And I said to him, well, what happened to him? He said, well, we had a concentration camp for SS men, and that's why I sent him. And he said, that was much worse than for the Jews. I said, much worse? Oh, he says, there we beat them. And then I said to him, did it ever occur to you to enrich yourself from, the possessions, the gold of these people that were killed? And, he said to me, what kind of a man do you think I am? So what I'm telling you, this man had a perverse code of honor in which obedience and loyalty and performance, right, stood at the top, where morals and personal judgment, really didn't figure. I don't know, you can stump me. I mean, I don't know whether you heard his wife complained bitterly about the stench in their home and asked him where did it come from. Oh, he says it's from a glue factory. And they had a visitor one night who said at dinner, Rudolph, that was his first name. He says, is it really true that you've already exterminated 1 million? I mean, that was at the beginning of his tour. And he said, yes. And after their visitor left, his wife said to him, Rudolph, is that really true? And he said, yes. And he said, the glue factory, well, it was a human glue factory. So his wife left his bed and would never allow him to touch her again. And I said to him, then what? Well, he found himself a nice mistress, a woman by the name of Eleanor Hodes. And for the life of me, I can't remember whether she was an inmate or an SS woman who worked in the camp. And I said, well, how was she? Oh, he said she was fabelhaft, wunderbar. She never asked me any questions.
You get done with this, and you're literally reading the transcript the next day. Did you have any kind of emotional reaction, visceral reaction of saying, my God, I heard this and I still can't believe it?
Well, I tell you what, I believed it. I mean, the guy was credible. And I tell you, I had an intellectual reaction. I began to understand how you make people like him into murderers. He volunteered at one time. He had a military education. He volunteered at one time to be sent to the Russian front, and he said, I was prepared to die a hero's death. And Himmler said to me, Rudolph, what you're doing is so much more important for the fatherland. We can't spare you. You go back to Auschwitz and do your duty. And what I'm telling you, the enormity of it was such, and trying to understand, how that whole system functioned, and trying to understand how the ordinary Germans were or were not involved, were they guilty, what did they know? I mean, he told me, it was punishable by death to talk about what we were doing. We located those big extermination camps, in areas that were absolutely off limits, even to the SS. So I think ordinary Germans knew about places like Dachau or Oranienburg, places that were in Germany and that had been started up in 1933. But, they were not extermination camps. They were concentration camps that indulged in what I called retail killing, by the hundreds and the thousands. So, I mean, this whole question of, what would the Germans do? No. What would I have done if I'd been an ordinary German? I got to tell you, those questions trying to understand, you know, how something like that could happen. And how people got involved in it. And how a man like that, you know, could sit there and not look like a wild animal of the jungle. How he could sit there and not look repulsive, you know, like a criminal type. I gotta tell you that my curiosity overwhelmed me more than my feelings. And I tell you today, it is so to this day, I can get very angry and I can get very hateful with the person who does something to me personally. As I say, I could have easily and gladly killed, you know, those guards in Dachau. You know, while I was a soldier, we fought against an SS division who captured some of our soldiers, cut their testicles off and stuffed them in their mouth. And I mean, that's not hearsay, we saw that. And you know what? If I'd seen one of those bastards, I would have shot them. And but that's different. I mean, you have a personal reason. You have somebody who committed a horrible act, a crime, and I guess my feelings against a person like that, you know, is violent, you know, as anybody else's. But my curiosity of what kind of people were the Goerings, you know, the Ribbentrops, the Husses of this world. I was trying to understand, because I'd grown up in that system and escaped it, and I didn't know what I was growing up in. I didn't realize how evil that system was. And you know, I have to tell you, I said to myself a few times, if I'd not been Jewish and I'd been given a chance, you know, to be a Nazi and become a hero and a soldier, you know, what would I have done? And all I can tell you is I hope to God I would have done the right thing, but who can be sure, you know, when they haven't had that temptation. So these people, you know, as I say, they were extremely interesting, because I couldn't imagine, you know, that people like that even existed.
As you're trying to understand the system, one of the guys that was probably number 2, not maybe number 3, and was Hess. And
Hess,
not Hearst, but Hess. And then you have an opportunity to be part of the interrogation of him, and he's an utter enigma at Nuremberg. What did you think of him?
Crazy man, crazy. I tell you what, he had a reputation from the word go, going back for years and years, of being eccentric. He was a food faddist. One of his closest friends was Professor Haushofer and his son Albrecht. Haushofer was married to a Jewish woman. Hess got her exempted from being Jewish and is responsible, you know, for her survival. She finally committed suicide with her husband after Nuremberg. He was a flyer in World War I. I mean, he was always a zealot, a patriotic zealot. You know, he was incarcerated with Hitler at Landsberg. It is said, and has been denied, I don't know what is true, that he took dictation from Hitler and really wrote down Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. And he was slavishly devoted to him. He was, I mean, he called Hitler the greatest son of the German people that had ever lived. He was his deputy, but people got confused. He was his deputy only as far as the party was concerned. He never became his deputy as far as the government is concerned. But for a while, the party and the government in Germany were indistinguishable, until even Hitler realized how eccentric and slavishly devoted he was to him, but, you know, with very, very poor judgment. And then you know that he remained the deputy as far as the party was concerned, but he named Goering as his deputy as far as the government is concerned. And Hess became more and more unimportant and more isolated. With the start of the war, nobody paid any attention to him. He had an underling by the name of Bormann, who was very ambitious, who managed to displace him. And I mean, you know all about Bormann. He was tried in absentia as, you know, one of the main Nazis. And so you had in Hess this combination of a guy who was eccentric, food faddist, psychosomatic symptoms, I mean stomach aches and cramps, been a flyer in World War I, and no question was lusting for recognition again. And Hitler refused to let him join the army. So then he got this crazy idea to fly to England. And he knew about the invasion of Russia. And he was totally mistaken about the English and the influence of the Duke of Hamilton. Figured he could become a hero all over again by talking the British into making a separate peace with Germany so as to free, Hitler's hand with Russia and stop Hitler from committing the blunder that killed him, which was really to fight a two-front war, of which the Germans were pathologically fearful, and then Hitler, launched them into it. So of course, Hess flew this plane into England, parachuted, managed to parachute not all that far, from his goal, and then found a completely cold, disinterested reception, from the British, and I think that blew his mind. And, I used to say about him, he lost his mind in England and his memory when he came to Nuremberg. Then he found it again, in the courtroom. And I don't know whether you've read his diary and the stories of him. I'm not a psychiatrist, but if you told me that he was a lunatic, I would not have argued with you.
So when I know we've talked in prior interview about that whole interrogation when Goering came in, etc. But when you looked in Hess's eyes, did you get a sense that he really was out of it?
Yeah, he had a weird look about him. His eyes were sort of in unfathomable caves. You've seen pictures of him. The man had a weird look about him. And, whether he was really fit to stand trial, I bow to the tribunal. I
know you've had a chance in fact, you're a celebrity here in Germany, as well as other places, and people have, when they come and they want to do documentaries and they come and ask you, obviously they've got an agenda of what they want to ask you. Are there questions that you expect to get that you don't get, and you'd like to tell somebody about?
Well, the Germans do ask how come I came back to Germany. That's one question. Another question that I get very frequently, I'm 81. I look at the audiences in Germany, and there may be one or two people my age. Most of them are younger. There's nobody there to have been really an active criminal Nazi of any stature. Remember, I was 22 years old at Nuremberg. That's when the war was over. Right. And anybody younger than I am, sure, they could have belonged to the Hitler Youth, but, they could not have been government officer or party officer. And their question to me forever is, you were there, how could something like this happen? Can you explain it to us? That's the question I get from, every German audience. I don't know whether you know why I went back to Germany. I went back because I had an invitation and brought my family to participate in this 800th anniversary of the little town where I grew up. And they had a meeting of, pupils of school in the morning, the day before, and they had a town meeting the evening before, And I decided to leave because I wasn't going to be Exhibit A in this commemoration, right? And I went there, to be honest with you, because my wife and children were interested to see where I'd grown up. But I met some people there. I mean, notably, I mentioned the widow of this minister and the minister himself, who just impressed me, you know, with their attitude, and we became friends. And she did a lot of educational work in the schools, and I eventually helped her to get a copy of a video which called Kitty, about a woman in concentration camps. And there then got to be reports in the German newspaper about my visits and some of these little speeches. And one day, again, I mean, out of the blue, the executive director of the American Jewish Committee asked me, would I be interested in going to Germany and speaking? And I said to him, about what? And he said, anything you want to. And I said, I will go on one condition. I respect your organization, and it's it's a wonderful organization, but I don't want to take on the coloration of any organization. I want to have a co-sponsor. And then the so-called Evangelical Church, the Lutheran Church of Germany, which has 60 million members, I mean, they're no denomination there, co-sponsored me. And so I was co-sponsored by the American Jewish Committee and the Evangelical Church of Germany, and spoke at a major cathedral in Berlin. And that caught the imagination of the German newspapers on TV. I mean, to my surprise, and all of a sudden, you know, this thing snowballed, and then I was invited, I'm sure you know, after the documentation center was dedicated by the German president, I was the first speaker there. And for me, I mean, that was a, you know, big event. A kid who'd been chased out of Germany, being at the Nuremberg trial, to, you know, be invited as the first speaker after President Roberts spoke in there at the documentation center, which was Hitler's, you know, old parade ground. And one of my sons and my granddaughter was with me. And it was a huge, huge overflow audience. And I spoke, and I felt I'd spoken too long, 45 minutes, and they kept me for an hour and a quarter afterwards, you know, with questions. And I will just say to you what I said to them. I mean, first, I go with Eli Wiesel, who said, the children are not guilty. And most of you are children of the perpetrators. And I go with Robert Jackson, who said that the guilty must be punished. And I think the guilty, for the most part, don't live anymore. And I don't think that all the guilty have been punished, but most of the guilty have been punished. And as for me, I belong to a human family that excludes only those that want to exclude themselves. And I hope you belong to that same human family. And that was my speech in Nuremberg. And as I say, they kept me with the question with which I started this little monologue. Can you explain it? And who can? But that's why I was fascinated. You know, I use that word advisedly and with regret with people like Hus and Goering and others, trying to understand what made them tick. How was it possible?
Is there a legacy of Nuremberg? Or should I rephrase it? What is the legacy?
Well, to me, the single tersest way to crystallize it is to quote Robert Jackson, who says, the time has come to punish big men and statesmen who commit crimes in the name of their office, for crimes for which every little man in every little country in the world gets punished. And it was the extension of morality and law from the rest of us, right, to statesmen. And to me, that was a legacy, because Nuremberg was the first time, you know, where statesmen, generals, foreign ministers, you know, and what have you, were called to task and punished. And, you know, I hope that progress in world law would be much more rapid than it has been. There has been progress, but not enough. And I think that single sentence of punishing people for crimes committed in office, the way every one of us is punished for crimes that we commit as private citizens or as corporate officers, you know, is certainly an important legacy of Nuremberg for me. And that's what it was all about.
What question hasn't been asked of you that you would like to give an answer?
None. Well, why isn't your book published in America? That question is asked. You know, my book was published in Germany, and by the way, the title of it that is on your website was an interim title. In German, the title is More Than One Life, and my agent has used different titles depending on who he's dealing with. I mean, knowing that the publisher will eventually decide on the title with me, right? And I have to tell you, the interest in Dick Sonnenfeldt is an unknown. I'm not a household word. The biography of a man like me, you know, doesn't draw any attention. In Germany, the book put Nuremberg up front, and it's all over the cover, and not many, but very few have complained that they were misled, that the book was all about Nuremberg, but it's about, you know, it's about my life. But the interest is now picking up because of, I think, Saddam Hussein, what you people are doing here. The 60th anniversary is coming up. So I hope that the interest in my book in America will, you know, lead to an early publication. I do have 3 publishers, you know, currently who are reviewing it.
It's such a terrific book, and as John and I discussed just last night, anybody who actually reads it, you can't help but get excited about your odyssey, of which Nuremberg is just a part. Obviously important to us, but you have an extraordinary life.
Yes, I did.
And continue to do so. Thanks a million, Dick. This has been just terrific. And we've just hit the tip of the iceberg.
So I hope you won't expose us soul to the full length of this.
This is terrific.
This is great. This is a really good session.
Some I've heard before, much I hadn't. You're right on.
Good.
You've earned a lunch.
You're the expert on, certainly on Jackson and
Well, on Jackson.
You're
You're the
amazing.
expert on Nuremberg, I think.
You're amazing. I mean, the depth of your
I want to show you.
research.
I want to show you one page, which probably you have, you know, at home or you've seen, but it's one of the things I copied at Ithaca out of the Donovan stuff. Just the first paragraph.
Well, you know what? I have the interrogation.
Right.
This he sent, this was the summary he sent to Jackson and Story and others.
Right.
This is in my book. I mean,
Yeah.
the whole thing, how we found it out.
Yep.
I remember like it was today. Here was Hitler standing behind the curtain, listening to the confession of this fake guy, I mean, accusing Fritz. By the way, he had homosexual relations in a toilet stall of the Charlottenburg rail station with the Captain Fritz. And Goering knew that. And they made very sure that as an interrogation.
Right.
They never used their title Captain or General.
Right.
Here's Hitler standing behind the curtain, you know, listening to the description of the illicit, sordid sex life of his top general. That's Goering.
Yeah. Powerful blackmail material.
We get you a bite to eat. How are you doing, Barbara?
I could have, frankly, I could have a drink and a bite to eat.
Well, let's do that.
Yeah.
Well, you're going to send me copies of this, right?
Of course.
And I have author's rights
You have
to
authors?
cut it.
Edit it. This is the raw material.
Let me tell you why I'm asking. I'll be very frank. My agent is absolutely after me to try and get English-speaking cuts.
Right.
You know, that he can, only to publishers. I mean, it will not be used any other way.
Well,
So you don't mind my doing
No,
that?
and tomorrow.
Tomorrow's going to be videotaped. Your speech is being taped.
Yeah, well, that's a public occasion.
Right.
But I thought I'd ask.
Oh, absolutely.
And I noticed you took some pictures.
Took some pictures. I'll get you copies of all those.
Take a picture of Barbara.
I want to. No. You read my mind. I want to.
In fact, we have a great portrait of Jackson out here. That ought to be the
spot.
Yeah.
But I tell you, I appreciate the opportunity. You got me all warmed up for tomorrow.
Good.
So hopefully I won't cool down.
The worst, I'm only halfway through my notes, but we better read them for days.
By the way, I have that one where the first thing, I think I'll put it up. Yeah, it's how Goering got rid of what was called the Minister Board and the Commander-in-Chief of the German Army, because he wanted to assume that post, in which case he would have been the chief executive of Germany, and Hitler would have been the chairman of the board, because Goering would have been only on service London. He got rid of the two of them, and then Hitler abolished the office and named himself Commander-in-Chief, and Goering, being trained in the old Imperial Army,